The days following the discovery of the bodies were filled with fear and rumor. Hinterkaifeck was a small, isolated farmstead, and for neighbors who had once felt secure in the quiet Bavarian countryside, safety suddenly vanished. People whispered about curses, demons, and ghosts haunting the Gruber family. Others spoke more practically, convinced that the killer was still nearby, perhaps blending into the very crowd that gathered to mourn. The funeral brought hundreds to the village, and with them came gossip. Victoria's reputation was central to much of it. She was rumored to have been in an incestuous relationship with her father Andreas, a fact that had even landed him in court years earlier. The scandal was never fully resolved, and whispers suggested that Joseph, the toddler, might not be Lorenz Schlittenbauer's child after all, but Andreas's. This rumor darkened the tragedy further, giving the murders an edge of twisted family shame that outsiders found both shocking and believable. Police clung to the possibility that Lorenz had committed the crime. His previous relationship with Victoria, his disputed paternity of Joseph, and his strange composure during the discovery all made him the prime suspect in public eyes. But every time investigators tried to build a case, it fell apart. No weapon was found on his property. No witnesses placed him at the scene during the murders. Even though many villagers remained convinced of his guilt, legally, there was nothing to hold him on. Other suspects came and went. A group of former farmhands who had left the Gruber household angrily were questioned. Perhaps one had returned for revenge. A traveling salesman was briefly suspected after being seen in nearby towns. Even distant relatives were interrogated. The police records ballooned with names, until the list of suspects numbered over 100. But despite the effort, the trail led nowhere. The most haunting theory was that the killer had lived in the attic before the murders. Several villagers recalled Andreas complaining in the weeks prior that he heard footsteps above the ceiling. He also found a newspaper from Munich in the house, one no one in the family admitted buying. When he spoke about these things, most dismissed him as paranoid. After the massacre, those details gained terrifying weight. If true, the murderer had been watching them for days, listening to their conversations, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This possibility sent chills through the village. It meant the killer had not only destroyed the family, but had intruded into their most private moments, sitting above them in silence. The thought was unbearable, and yet it fit the facts too well to be ignored. But just as quickly as the murders shocked Bavaria, they began to fade into unsolved mystery. Investigators exhausted their leads. Witnesses contradicted one another. With no physical evidence and only speculation, the case grew colder with each passing month. The killer had taken 6 lives and walked away unseen, leaving behind nothing but fear and questions. As months turned into years, the investigation into Hinterkaifeck dragged on without resolution. Yet the story never stopped haunting those who lived nearby. Every creak in the farmhouse, every shadow on the road at night, became a reminder that the murderer had never been caught. The Gruber farm itself added to the unease. After the murders, it stood empty, a grim monument to the crime. Neighbors reported strange noises, as if someone still walked its halls. Some claimed to see flickering lights inside, long after the bodies had been buried. The farm, once alive with work and routine, became a place of dread. Eventually, the property was torn down, but before that, people entered the house out of morbid curiosity, hoping to glimpse the scene where such horrors unfolded. The barn where the bodies were found felt particularly heavy, as though the violence lingered in the air. For locals, it was impossible to forget that someone had lived in those walls, watched the family, and then slaughtered them with a pickaxe. Theories multiplied as the years passed. Some were rational, others bizarre. One popular idea was that Lorenz Schlittenbauer truly was the killer, motivated by anger over Joseph's paternity. Supporters of this theory pointed to his suspicious behavior and his intimate knowledge of the farm. But his defenders argued that if he had committed the murders, why would he call for others to help search the property? Why would he risk exposing himself? Another theory centered on robbery gone wrong. Yet nothing of value was missing, and the killer's decision to remain in the house contradicted such a motive. Robbers rarely linger. They take what they want and escape. Whoever stayed at Hinterkaifeck acted like someone with purpose, someone comfortable enough to make meals and tend animals. Some investigators suggested the killer could have been a family member, perhaps a relative with a grudge. Yet no evidence tied anyone from the extended family to the crime. The possibility of a traveling stranger was also floated, but the calculated nature of the killings and the familiarity with the farm made that unlikely. The attic theory remained the most chilling. If the killer had lived above the family unseen, it explained much. The missing keys, the newspaper from Munich, the footsteps Andreas heard. It meant the murders were not sudden but carefully prepared, carried out after days of watching. The thought that someone could lurk so close, unseen and patient, gave the crime an almost supernatural edge, though in reality it was simply human cruelty in its darkest form. Despite endless speculation, no arrest was ever made. More than 100 suspects were considered, interrogated, and dismissed. The case became one of Germany's most infamous unsolved mysteries. Families in Bavaria locked their doors more tightly, and children grew up hearing warnings about Hinterkaifeck. The crime was no longer just a tragedy, but a legend. Even now, the murders remain unsolved. Each theory offers a possible answer, but none can be proven. The truth is locked away with the dead, buried in silence on that lonely farmstead. As decades passed, Hinterkaifeck did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it became one of the most studied cases in German criminal history. Generations of detectives, journalists, and amateur investigators returned again and again to the mystery, searching for answers in the silence left behind. But every search uncovered only more questions. Forensic science advanced, and with it came hope that modern techniques could solve what 1920s investigators could not. In 2007, German police reopened the files and re-examined the evidence with contemporary methods. They identified a prime suspect, someone they believed could have been the murderer, but the name was never made public, and because the suspect was long dead, no trial was possible. Out of respect for surviving relatives, the identity was sealed. This revelation only deepened the intrigue, fueling speculation while withholding closure. The secrecy around the modern findings mirrors the very nature of the crime itself. Hinterkaifeck was always a story of shadows. A killer who moved silently, struck with brutal precision, then lingered in the victim's home like a ghost. A family with scandalous rumors that blurred motives and created endless suspects. A community that trampled the evidence in its rush to see the horror for themselves. Every piece of the case is wrapped in uncertainty. One of the most disturbing elements is the way the killer stayed after the murders. Few crimes in history show such chilling calm. The family's farm animals were fed. Meals were prepared and eaten. Even the fire in the stove was kept burning. This was not the behavior of a man panicked by what he had done. This was someone who felt control, perhaps even satisfaction. The thought that the murderer lived among the bodies for days still chills those who read the case today. Equally unsettling is the sense that the crime could not have been carried out by a complete stranger. The killer lured the family, one by one, into the barn. This required knowledge of their habits, their trust, and their vulnerabilities. Then, after the slaughter, he moved freely through their home, tending to tasks as if he belonged there. A drifter passing through could not have achieved this. It suggests familiarity, and if the killer was indeed someone they knew, then the betrayal runs even deeper. Theories endure because each holds fragments of truth. Lorenz Schlittenbauer remains a strong candidate in many eyes, especially because of his intimate connection to Victoria and Joseph. But defenders argue that he was scapegoated by villagers eager to pin the horror on someone close at hand. Others insist the attic theory explains everything: the noises Andreas reported, the misplaced newspaper, the missing keys. If correct, it means the family was watched for days by the very man who would destroy them, a predator waiting in silence. Whatever the truth, the failure to solve the case leaves a haunting legacy. The Grubers were buried together, but not even death brought them peace. Their story has been retold countless times in books, documentaries, and theories that try to give meaning to the senseless. Yet every telling comes back to the same conclusion: 6 lives were taken, and the killer disappeared into history, unnamed and unpunished. For those who study the case, the lesson is not only about murder, but about memory. Hinterkaifeck reveals how communities deal with horror. The villagers responded with suspicion, gossip, and fear. Police struggled with limited tools and mistakes that destroyed evidence. Later generations tried to impose reason on a crime that may never yield it. In the end, all that remains is the enduring question: who walked into that farmhouse, killed 6 people, then calmly lived among their corpses before walking away forever? The mystery of Hinterkaifeck has survived because it strikes at something primal. It is not just about murder, but about invasion, betrayal, and the fear that evil can hide in plain sight. It is about the footsteps Andreas heard above him at night, dismissed until it was too late. It is about the trust that led each family member into the barn, unaware they were walking to their deaths. It is about the eerie calm of a killer who could milk cows and feed pigs with blood still drying on his hands. Nearly a century later, the farm is gone, torn down to erase its darkness. But the fields remain quiet and unassuming. Travelers pass by, often unaware of the history buried in that soil. Yet for those who know, Hinterkaifeck is never just farmland. It is a reminder of 6 lives cut short and a murderer who walked free. Perhaps the final horror of Hinterkaifeck is not the brutality of the act, but the silence that followed. 6 coffins carried into the ground, more than 100 suspects interrogated, endless theories debated, and still no justice. The killer blended into the world, nameless, faceless, forgotten by law but never by history. And so the story endures. Hinterkaifeck remains unsolved, an echo from 1922 that still chills us today. In the end, the Grubers' tragedy is not just a crime story. It is a reminder that sometimes evil cannot be explained, and sometimes the truth slips away, leaving only shadows where answers should be.
"Did you hear that?" little Chesalia whispered to her mother Victoria, clutching her blanket. "The footsteps. There on the roof again, Victoria froze. She pulled back the curtain and stared into the darkness outside, nothing but a blanket of snow and the tall, silent woods. She forced a smile for her daughter. "It's only the wind. Go to sleep, my love." But Victoria knew it wasn't the wind. Her heart was racing. The sound had been real. Someone was walking above them. It was March 1922, a bitterly cold month in Bavaria, Germany. Hinterkaifeck wasn't even a real village, just the name of an isolated farmstead, an hour's walk from the nearest town of Gribben. To this day, the events of that place remain one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in European history. The Gruber family lived there. Andreas Gruber, 63, a harsh and deeply unpopular man. His wife Cecilia, 72, cold and equally unwelcoming. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, 35, lived with them along with her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. They had just hired a new maid, Maria Bogart. March 31st was her very first day at the farm. She would not live to see another, but the murders did not come without warning. In the days leading up to the slaughter, strange things had been happening. Andreas told neighbors about footprints he discovered in the snow. They led from the forest directly up to the farmhouse, but there were no returning prints. Whoever came never walked back. Doors showed signs of tampering. Keys disappeared. At night, footsteps echoed in the attic, though Andreas searched and found nothing. The family lived in a constant state of unease. "Father, there's someone up there," Victoria said one night, her voice low as the family sat in silence after dinner. Andreas snatched a lantern, stormed up the ladder to the attic, and found only shadows and dust, but the unease never left. By the time Maria arrived on March 31st, even she felt it. After helping her carry her belongings inside, Maria's sister hesitated at the door. Later, she confessed, "Something told me not to leave her there. I don't know why, but the house felt wrong." That night, the wrongness became horror. The killer struck with a mattock, a heavy farming tool. Investigators later pieced together what must have happened. One by one, Andreas, his wife Cecilia, Victoria, and little Cecilia were lured or driven into the barn. Perhaps they heard a noise, perhaps someone called them out. In the freezing dark, each was murdered brutally. 7-year-old Cecilia clutched her hair in agony, pulling it out in terror before she died. Their bodies were stacked and partially covered with hay. Inside the house, Joseph was killed in his crib. The maid Maria was slain in her bed, still dressed in her work clothes. Her first day had become her last. But the most chilling detail was yet to come. The killer didn't leave. Smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney for days after the murders. The cows were milked, the animals fed, fresh meals eaten from the kitchen. The family dog was cared for, all while 6 corpses lay cold and rotting nearby. Neighbors knocked on the door, but no one answered. Concern grew. Finally, several men from the village forced their way inside. The sight that greeted them was beyond comprehension. 6 people, hacked to death. Silence in the barn, silence in the house, but the faint smell of food lingered. The animals stood calm. Someone had been living there, as if the house belonged to them now. Who could kill, and then stay? That question haunts Hinterkaifeck to this very day. Some said it was a stranger from the forest, a vagrant who found the farm too tempting. Others believed it was someone closer, someone who knew the house and the family all too well. And some whispered something even darker, that the killer had already been inside long before that night. The woods stood silent outside, but the farmhouse seemed alive with secrets. And the footsteps on the roof. Perhaps they had never stopped. Andreas Gruber pushed open the heavy wooden door to the attic, the hinges groaning as though the house itself wanted to warn him away. He carried a lantern, its dim flame casting nervous shadows on the slanted walls. For weeks he had heard the soft shuffle of feet above, the scrape of something being dragged, and once, even a muffled cough. But each time he searched, he found nothing. "Victoria," he called down the stairs, his voice firm but uneasy. "There is no one here, only rats." From the kitchen below, Victoria Gabriel, his daughter, answered sharply, "Rats do not move furniture, father." Andreas tightened his grip on the lantern. He did not want to admit she was right. Earlier that week, the family had discovered footprints in the snow. They led from the woods straight to their isolated farmstead, Hinterkaifeck, but curiously, none led away. The discovery had left the family uneasy, whispering about intruders or worse. That night, as the lantern flickered in the attic, Andreas swore he heard something again, a breath, a faint shift of weight on the wooden planks. His heart quickened. "Show yourself," he barked, trying to drown his fear with anger. Silence answered. But when he turned to leave, he noticed something odd. A small patch of hay on the floor, disturbed, almost as though someone had been lying there. He crouched down, running his hand over the flattened straw. It was warm, recently used. Later that evening, the family sat together in the kitchen. The fire cracked, the storm outside whistling against the shutters. The atmosphere was heavy with dread. Andreas cleared his throat. "Someone is in this house. I can feel it." His wife Cecilia crossed herself nervously. "We should go to the police." "No," Andreas muttered, slamming his hand on the table. "We are not children. If someone dares to stay here, I will deal with them myself." 6-year-old little Cecilia, the youngest, looked up with wide eyes. "Papa, will they hurt us?" Her words silenced the room. Victoria pulled her daughter close, forcing a smile she did not feel. "No, darling. No one will hurt us," but in her own heart, Victoria was not sure. That night, sleep refused to come. Victoria awoke to the sound of soft humming. She froze. It was not coming from her own room. It was faint but clear, echoing from the attic above her. A low, tuneless hum, like someone rocking themselves in the dark. She sat up in bed, clutching the blanket. "Father," she whispered into the night, though he could not hear her. The sound continued for several minutes before fading into silence. The next morning, when Victoria entered the barn, she found tools misplaced. The scythe leaned awkwardly against the wall, the hammer gone. She asked her father about it, but he denied moving anything. By now, paranoia began to twist every corner of Hinterkaifeck. The family dog barked at nothing. Doors creaked open without a touch. Food disappeared from the pantry. The farm was no longer a home. It was a trap. 2 days later, a neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer stopped by. He was a stout man, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. He noticed the strained faces, the sleepless looks. "You all look like ghosts," Lorenz said, half joking. "What troubles you?" Andreas recounted the footprints, the noises, the attic straw. Lorenz listened carefully, his brow furrowing. "You should leave this place," Lorenz advised. "Something is not right here. This farm is cursed." Andreas scoffed, though his hands trembled slightly. "I will not abandon my land to shadows." Lorenz studied him for a long moment before replying. "Then be careful, Gruber. Evil often hides where we least expect it." That evening, as the sun set behind the Bavarian woods, Victoria caught her father staring at the attic ceiling again, his jaw tight. She walked up to him quietly. "Father," she said softly, "what if it's not a man? What if it's something else?" Andreas turned to her, his eyes hard. "If it bleeds, it's a man. And if it's a man, I will kill him." But even as he said the words, the lantern in his hand flickered violently, as if a breath of air had blown through the closed house. Neither of them spoke. For in that moment, they both knew the truth. They were not alone at Hinterkaifeck. She woke to a sound like someone dragging a chair across the attic floor. Victoria sat bolt upright. The room was dark. Snow made the world outside mute. Her breath fogged the air. Her heart hammered. She crept out of bed. The house was quiet except for that slow scrape above. The hairs on her arms stood up. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and climbed the ladder to the loft. The attic smelled of straw and cold. The weak lamp in her hand threw long, nervous shadows. There was movement. A scrap of hay shifted as if a hand had brushed it. Victoria froze. She called down, "Father." Her voice barely carried. No answer. The scrape stopped. For a moment she thought she heard whispering, then nothing. She felt watched. She went back to bed and pretended to sleep. The noise returned in fits and starts. It sounded like someone arranging straw for a bed. It sounded like breathing where no one should breathe. She closed her eyes and counted the minutes until dawn. When morning came, the dog whined at the door. The weather was gray. Neighbors walked past without looking at the house. Rumors ran ahead of them like dogs. The missing keys, the footprints in the snow, the attic footsteps. People crossed themselves at the sight of the farm. That day, Victoria found a small newspaper in the kitchen. It was from Munich, clean and folded. No one in the family read that paper. She tucked it under a plate and left for the barn. The cows needed milking. The rhythmic work calmed her. The shed smelled of hay and manure. Life went on in the small tasks. Yet every time she bent to milk, she felt a pair of eyes at her back. Lorenz stopped by again that afternoon. He watched Victoria from the yard. "You should leave," he said without preamble. "This place is bad for you, bad for the children." His voice was low. He did not smile. Victoria met his gaze. "Leave," she replied. "My children have nowhere to go. Our land is our life." Lorenz shifted. He looked at the house as if a man could read a structure the way a priest reads a prayer book. "There are things you cannot see. You must trust what your body tells you." She did not answer. She knew his words were meant to frighten or to help. She could not tell which. That night, the family sat at table. The lamp's glow made the room a small island in a gray sea. Andreas pushed his food plate away as if the taste had gone sour. He told the children stories he had told them 1,000 times. His voice tried to be hearty. It trembled. Little Cecilia slept fitfully and woke with nightmares. She wrapped herself around her mother. "Mama," she whispered, "the ceiling is moving." Victoria hugged her and lied. "It is only the wind, darling." When the house fell still and dark, someone outside whistled a slow, tuneless note. It slipped through the shutters. The dog barked twice and then silence swallowed the yard. In another house, a clock chimed the hour. At that chime, the footsteps began again. The next morning, a neighbor noticed that the barn gate was slightly ajar. He closed it and went about his day. He later said he had thought little of it. "Routine numbs us to danger. We assume someone left a gate open and will mend it." He had no reason to suspect evil. The truth was closer than anyone imagined. That night, a traveling salesman passed on the road below Hinterkaifeck. He saw the house smoke and called out. No answer. He had a bad feeling and he rode on. A bad feeling is a thin thread that sometimes turns into a rope. On April 2nd, a schoolboy failed to show at class. Teachers sent a messenger to the farm. Knock, 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 no answer. They left, puzzled. The next day the dog roamed the fields and would not stop. It slipped through a hedge and ran to a group of men. It whined and pressed itself against them as if begging them to follow. The men went and entered the barn. They found bodies covered with hay. For a moment no one in that group could speak. Cold rose into the air like a living thing. They ran into the house. The cries they made echoed through the trees. People gathered. Mothers fainted. Men swore they would catch the killer. The sight was a horror the mind refused to absorb. A man, an old woman, a mother, a child, a toddler in a crib. The maid, the new hand, the stranger who had come for work. Blood soaked the straw. The faces were bruised and split and still. The room smelled of iron and cold. Investigators arrived from the town with notepads and heavy boots. They tried to be clinical. They circled the scene and asked who had last seen the family. Suspicions passed like a wind. Lorenz was the first to speak openly. He looked pale and said he had found footprints in the snow. He admitted he had been in the yard that week. He said he had heard the dog bark and then nothing. They questioned him for hours. He answered with short sentences. He stared at the men as if he wished to be believed. He admitted he had loved Victoria once. He admitted he might be the father of Joseph. In a small village, a father can become a suspect simply by admitting intimacy. Other names came into the circle. A disgruntled farmhand, a drifter seen near the woods. A man who owed money to Andreas. The police wrote every name down. More than 100 would pass through questioning in the months to come. Each answer raised more questions. Each alibi had cracks. The investigators found the mattock buried under straw in the barn. It was smeared with blood. The dog's tracks, the prints in the snow, the locks broken and the keys gone. They tried to piece the map of that night. Who called whom out? Who answered that call? Who trusted the voice outside the door enough to step out into the dark? The liveliest debate that first week centered on the attic. Andreas had said he heard someone up there. The straw showed impressions like someone had slept. The newspaper from Munich bothered them. It suggested that someone had come from town, or someone who wanted to appear to be from town had come. The idea that the killer had hidden in the loft for days and watched the family eat, sleep, quarrel, and live then strike bore down on the people like a physical weight. It made every gesture suspect. It made privacy impossible. The horror was not only that 6 had died, it was that someone had been among the living and remained calm afterward. The murderer had not fled in panic. He had tended animals and lit fires. He had, in some dark way, continued the family routine. Rumors rippled out like poison. One man swore an escaped soldier had been seen near the woods. Another swore the killer was a lover scorned. A woman claimed she had heard wails the night the bodies lay cold. A dozen different stories, each changing small facts, made the truth slippery. Detectives fought against the noise. They tried to keep notes clean and logic simple. But the scene had been compromised. Curious townsmen trampled the rooms. The blood on the floor had been smeared by hands that wished to help. Evidence vanished under boots and grief. Still, names stuck. Lorenz could not shake attention. The salesman who rode by said he had seen a man near the lane that night. An old enemy of Andreas was asked to step forward. Each time the police questioned someone, the village held its breath and then turned to gossip. The farm became more than a crime scene. It became a mirror. Every person who looked at it saw their own fears reflected. The attic became a rumor box. The newsprint fueled the rumor. Men who had never met a Gruber now had opinions about their sins. And through all this, the central fact sat cold and immobile. Someone had killed 6 people and then stayed. The question that sat under all others was simple. How do you punish a crime when you cannot find the criminal? How do you close a wound when no hand can be tied for it? They would search, they would accuse, they would grieve. But every night, when the wind moved the trees and distant wolves howled, Hinterkaifeck seemed to keep one last secret. It watched as if waiting for someone brave enough to take it back. You said. The investigation dragged into its second week, and Hinterkaifeck became less a farm and more a stage for suspicion. The men who came to question the neighbors found themselves surrounded not only by facts but by whispers, each one heavier than the last. Villagers were drawn to the farm as though compelled by some unseen hand. They walked its yard, stared at its doors, and lowered their voices when they spoke of the things inside. But the evidence itself did not lie. The investigators catalogued it piece by piece. There were the impressions in the hayloft where someone had slept. There was the strange Munich newspaper no one in the Gruber household had ever purchased. There was the broken lock, the missing keys, the footprints that seemed to vanish into the fields, and there was the mattock, the farm tool that had been turned into an instrument of slaughter, hidden as if in shame under straw. What troubled the police most, however, was not only the brutality of the killings but the calm that followed them. Whoever committed the murders had lingered. The animals had been fed, the stables tended. Smoke had continued to rise from the chimney. It meant that after bludgeoning 6 people, including children, the killer had remained. He had eaten their food. He had slept under their roof. He had lived in their silence. That was the part that sent the strongest shiver through the investigators and the neighbors alike. Murder is one horror. The lingering presence of the murderer is another, deeper kind. It implies comfort where there should be none. It suggests possession, as though the killer had taken not just lives but the home itself. The first circle of suspicion naturally fell on those closest to the family. Lorenz Schlittenbauer was at the center. His history with Victoria, the suggestion that he might have fathered her youngest child, and his immediate involvement in discovering the bodies all painted him as someone too close to ignore. Lorenz claimed innocence. He said he was among the first to step into the barn and uncover the horror, and he insisted he had nothing to do with it. Still, his calmness at the scene unsettled some. He had moved hay from the corpses. He had touched things without hesitation. One man swore Lorenz had handled the bodies with a familiarity too casual for the moment. When asked why, Lorenz replied sharply, "If I didn't move them, who would? They were my neighbors." Victoria was. He stopped himself, and the silence that followed said more than his words. Others suspected traveling laborers. Germany in 1922 was full of displaced men, soldiers from a lost war, vagabonds who walked the countryside looking for work. Any one of them could have sought shelter in the loft, taken advantage of the isolation of the farm, and struck when the chance arose. Yet the crime had not been sloppy. It had been deliberate, staged in a way that suggested knowledge of the household. That detail made it harder to believe in a passing drifter. The investigators expanded the net. They questioned former farmhands, men who had left Hinterkaifeck after bitter quarrels. One had sworn revenge on Andreas Gruber for unpaid wages. Another had been dismissed after disputes with Victoria. Each denied involvement, though bitterness lingered in their words. Each had alibis that, on the surface, seemed intact. And still the questions grew. How had the killer lured the family to the barn? One theory suggested a sound, a whimper, a knock, a disturbance in the animals that drew them out one by one. Each victim may have followed the last, never realizing they were stepping into a trap. The order of death became a puzzle. Who died first? Who was left to see the others fall? The injuries spoke, but not clearly enough. Forensic science in 1922 was far from precise. The doctors examined the wounds and concluded they were caused by the mattock, swung with violent force. Some faces were disfigured beyond recognition. Victoria's injuries were particularly brutal. Her skull shattered, her throat marked as though strangled before the final blow. Little Cecilia, the child, showed signs she may have lived for hours after the attack, pulling her own hair in agony before death claimed her. That detail was so cruel that even the most hardened policeman had to step outside and breathe. The maid, Maria, had arrived only hours before the massacre. Her first night in her new employment had been her last. For her, there was no motive. She was simply unlucky, caught in a storm that belonged to the family she served. As the days turned into weeks, the theories darkened. Some whispered that the crime was not born of human hands alone. The sounds in the attic, the missing keys, the strange newspaper, the footprints that appeared and then vanished, these details made people wonder about something unearthly. In rural Bavaria, superstition was not easily dismissed. Old stories of spirits and demons tangled with the facts. Some villagers believed the farm was cursed, that something had claimed the Grubers for reasons no detective could write in a report. But the police clung to the human suspects. They interviewed more than 100 individuals, from neighbors to strangers, from relatives to former workers. Each lead eventually fell apart. Each alibi held at least enough to escape charges. And yet, the unease did not fade. Months later, when the case went cold, people continued to avoid the farm. Children would not walk past it at night. Grown men claimed they heard noises from its ruins. Women said they saw shapes in the windows. The land seemed to reject life. Even after the farm buildings were demolished years later, visitors reported feelings of dread when they walked across the site. The mystery of Hinterkaifeck did not end with the case files. It only grew larger. Historians, criminologists, and paranormal enthusiasts would revisit it for decades. They found themselves circling the same strange evidence. Why did the killer stay? Why were the animals fed, the chimney smoking, the household maintained for days after the murders? Who had keys to the house? Why did Andreas Gruber report hearing footsteps above him and then dismiss it? And perhaps most haunting of all, why, after more than 100 suspects, did no one ever face trial? Some claimed the killer was among those interviewed, protected by silence, luck, or lack of proof. Others believed the murderer was a stranger who slipped away, never to be seen again. And others quietly, in the corners of taverns and kitchens, muttered that the real killer never left at all. For the horror of Hinterkaifeck is not just in the crime. It is in the absence of resolution. 6 lives were taken in a place already marked by unease, and the truth was buried as deeply as the victims themselves. The farm rotted. The case grew cold, and the legend took root, twisting through generations. Even today, when researchers lay the old photographs on their desks and pore over the testimonies, they describe the same feeling, a pressure at the edge of the room, a sensation that someone unseen is watching, as if the attic at Hinterkaifeck still keeps its tenant. And so the story endures, not as a case solved, but as a wound never closed. The killer vanished, but the shadow he left has never gone. The search for the truth about Hinterkaifeck has consumed countless investigators, journalists and amateur sleuths for more than a century. Police files, old testimonies and rumors have been dissected endlessly, but the one element often overlooked is what cannot be explained by reason alone. For some, the Hinterkaifeck massacre was not only a crime, but also a haunting and event where the line between the natural and the supernatural blurred in terrifying ways. It begins with the strange signs before the murders. Footsteps in the snow that led toward the house but not away. Footsteps in the attic when no intruder could be found. Doors unlocked, keys missing, voices at night that no one could trace. If these had been isolated incidents, perhaps they could be dismissed. But when added together, they form the outline of something far more disturbing. Neighbors would later claim that in the weeks before the murders, they saw flickering lights in the attic window, even when the family swore no one was up there. Children claimed they saw a shadowy man standing at the edge of the woods, watching the house, but whenever adults went to check, there was nothing. Victoria herself told friends that she felt as though something dark was closing in on them. It was as if Hinterkaifeck had already been marked claimed before the murders even happened. In the years after the massacre, villagers avoided the farm. Some refused to walk the road past it at night. Others swore that they heard screams echoing from the barn long after the family had been buried. A few even claimed to hear the cries of little Chiselia, the 7-year-old who died in terror. Hunters reported seeing a man-shaped figure moving between the trees near the property, though no one ever dared follow.